Hello and welcome back to the Doctor Who Marathon. I'm your host McEdam, and today we're going to be talking about the Sarah Jane Adventure Series 2 story, Secret of the Stars, written by Gareth Roberts and is directed by Michael Granigan. This is the second story to feature Rani, played magnificently by Anja Mahindra, and it is also the story that mainly focuses on star signs. This story was originally written as an actual sequel to the fourth Doctor story, The Mask of Mandragora, and it was going to actually feature the Mandragora itself, which, in terms of us talking about it in the marathon, last appeared in the 10th Doctor novel, Beautiful Chaos. So that was really some interesting stuff. However, it was later then decided that the character, or the energy source, whatever it is, because it's not really an individual, but anyway, didn't really fit this particular story, or at least the villain was too big to be part of a undernoted story. So they decided that they're going to change it to a completely new entity. Although I do feel like the story, it's so clearly supposed to be Mandragora that I don't understand why they bothered writing him out. To be honest, it seems almost like a rip-off of Mandragora, to the point where you may as well have kept the same character. In terms of popular opinion, I'm not too sure. I can't find a lot of information on people's opinion on this. It seems to be one that's the least favourite out of this series. I mean, I've heard a lot of great things about this story. However, this series, or should I say, this entire season 2 of Sarah Jane, is a very popular season of Sarah Jane Adventures. So this one being the lowest one isn't that big of a criticism with the adventure. So that's some interesting stuff. So shall we get on to the episode? The story starts off in a pre-credit sequence in which we see this man named Truman, and he is basically reading the star signs to this woman, but his conscience kind of gets the better of him. It's really funny because the woman is like, "This is amazing. We thought that my partner thought that this was all like make believe, but then you told me stuff that actually turned out real." And the guy just goes, "You've got to keep your money. I'm a fraud. I'm just a con man." And he just is like, he just confesses everything, that star signs and all that are complete and utter nonsense, which is absolutely hilarious. And he goes up to his window when suddenly an energy source, known as the Ancient Light, which of course was originally the Mandragora in the original script, takes over him, and he kind of becomes this possessed creature where it's like the stars are aligned and I finally can find my purpose. And he also seems to have some sort of power, as the pre-credit sequence ends with him basically zapping the woman as she starts screaming, and basically tells her that she is destined for all this amazing stuff, and that ends into the credits. It's a decent pre-credit sequence. I mean, we don't really know much of these characters. I'm very sad that it's more funny than anything else, with the con man just confessing, basically revealing he's just a terrible con man if his conscience gets the better of him like this. I just personally found it really funny. But when we cut into the actual story, Sarah Jane, actually all of our characters, mainly Clive, Rani and Luke, are going into this show, as Truman seems to take place a while after the events of the pre-credit sequence, and he seems to be this celebrity figure, and they're all going to see him. And basically, I think it was Rani's idea for them to go, because Clive doesn't believe in star signs whatsoever, and Luke, being the more logical one, basically just describes how irrelevant star signs are and how they don't make any sense on a scientific level. But Rani is, not that she believes, but she is interested in star signs and what they mean, and she just basically is just like, I know it's not real, but I'm very interested, and it's real, and it's just a bit of fun, you know. And it turns out then the parent characters, Rani's parents and Sarah Jane, also get invited to see Truman's show, and so they get into it. And Sarah Jane kind of gets the feeling that something is wrong, and Rani kind of tries to push her, being a inspiring journalist, tries to get Sarah Jane to see a sort of story here, which I love that dynamic. However, we got to talk about Rani for the moment, because I feel like this story was written before Rani was a character, because there are certain elements with Rani that stay here that feel like her character. She is much more like an apprentice to Sarah Jane than a friend with a massive age gap like Maria was. But in terms of her role in the story, and more specifically the parents' role in the dynamic, it feels like something is off, because Rani, in terms of her character in the series now, has a very unique aspect, because her father is a teacher, and he is the teacher that has a much more authority over Luke and Clive, which makes him much different to the character of Alan from the previous series. So I felt like we could have gotten some really interesting dynamic there, especially how Alan was an interesting character. So I thought we were going to get into a tradition of great father characters taken in the role. But nothing ever seems like that. There's no scenes in the story which are set in the school, and it feels like that dynamic wasn't thought up yet when writing this story, because it has no real part in the play in it. And I feel like it doesn't bother me as much, but the fact that it is Rani's second story, it does kind of feel off, if that makes any sense. Maybe it's less to do with the actual story itself and more with the placing of the story within the series. Who knows? We'll have to find out in other stories. I hope that we do get that dynamic later on in the series, but here, never brought up, really. And Maria's mother kind of has this fascination, and I think she believes in the star signs. But anyway, they go into the theatre, and Truman comes out and he starts touching people on the shoulder, including Clive, and he seems to have some sort of control of people out of the ones he touched, because he tells them to get up, and then he tells them to sit down, and he has this little funny moment which he tells them to sit up and sit down. I personally thought it was a bit cheesy and a bit silly, but I guess that was kind of the point. And he's basically pointed out the characters, and he's like, I see that your star sign is blah blah blah. I see in you that you are all of these details, and Sarah Jane should get some reasonable explanations. Earlier on, she saw that one of Truman's secretary, this woman, who was actually the woman from the start of the episode, which I didn't actually recognise. They give her this much more fancy costume and did up her hair. I didn't realise it was the same character, but and the portrayal is all different. So it was only really later on I clicked. It's oh yeah, that's her. Wow, I'm a complete idiot. That's my fault, not the story's fault. In which Sarah Jane and Rani do basically see her husband come up and is just like, I'm not leaving without you. You're acting all strange. You're acting all different. This is not like you. You're not acting like yourself. And she is just like, if you're not going to see Truman, I will call the police or something like that. And she seems really strange. And Sarah Jane can see this and kind of feels like that there is might be a story there, but at the moment she's trying to disprove everything with Clive being forced to stand up and stand down. She says it's hypnotic suggestion. When he points out to a character in the audience, Sarah Jane is just like, that was somebody planted there. It's all set up. like she was there, this has been rehearsed. But then he points out Rani and basically says that like she has just recently moved and you've had this new adventure, this new lease on life. That's not to do with your family. It has nothing to do with your father, maybe, but there's another role model in your life that has now opened your eyes to the larger world. And it's like, yes, and it's amazing. Everybody starts clapping and stuff. And then he points out Sarah Jane. And then this is where it starts to get serious. And I like the slow build up to the scene as Sarah Jane basically tried to justify everything, and slowly does he get around to her. And then this is where like the real thing starts kicking in. I think what makes this story so enjoyable is that it cuts all the fat out, which might be an issue. We'll get into that later. But with this story, I feel like there is a great sense of pacing, as right off the bat we kind of get the impression of who the villain is and what he's doing, as he basically tells Sarah Jane, it's just like, you once travelled and you had this amazing life and you were fantastic, but not anymore. And you had this friendship. It wasn't a love, but it was something far more important than love. And you travelled with this professor. No, not a professor, a doctor. And Sarah Jane is just like, yes, and how did you know that? It's like, oh, I can't tell, it's all in the stars. And Sarah Jane basically is just like, well, tell us about the future. And this guy is just like, well, I can tell you something for a start. You have had so many victories in your life. You have constantly had victories. But soon something will alter in your destiny. And soon you will have a different destiny. Soon you will fail. And that puts this like shock into Sarah Jane. She also gets flashbacks to school reunion. And I know a lot of people have said this, and I will admit it is a nitpick. It's 100% a nitpick. And I understand why it wasn't included. And, you know, I really, in all reality, I actually have no problem with it. But as a fanboy, as somebody who has enjoyed Doctor Who for so many years, where was the flashbacks to the third and fourth Doctors? I mean, Sarah Jane, fair enough, you know, the last time she's seen the Doctor was in his 10th persona, so that's kind of like the recent memory she has of him. But she spent most of her life with the fourth Doctor, and her first Doctor was the third. Why? Of course, I know the reason why. The reason why is that this is for a younger demographic. Therefore, they wouldn't have necessarily known about the third and fourth Doctors, with only really the fourth Doctor, with the fifth. Wow, sorry, my brain fuzzled out there. The 10th Doctor to be in the memory of the story, and so when kids have flashbacks, you know, they might have been like, who the hell are these two? But then it might have led them into an interesting classic Who. So, who knows? It's a nitpick. It's a massive, massive nitpick. And so Sarah Jane and Rani are basically trying to discuss things, and she tries to get Mr. Smith to basically find out what's going on. How does he know about all this? And like I said, what is great about this story is that it has no real fat. It gets right into the story, right into the narrative, as Mr. Smith has no idea. There seems to be no sort of alien information there. There seems to be no alien technology, nothing. And that these characters start slowly believing that star signs and all of this hokery-pokery magic stuff might actually be possible. It's a law of reality that is outside the laws of physics and quantum mechanics and stuff like that. It's its own science, which is impossible, and none of these characters believe that the star signs are possible, with the exception of really the Rani, who's she's kind of like leading into it. And it's actually Rani who kind of comes up with this theory that this energy is coming from a different universe. And so we have that. And before Sarah Jane starts investigating, we also have one of the most key aspects of the story. For you see, all of these characters are talking about birth signs and the star signs, which all links into their birth when they were babies and stuff. Which kind of gets Luke, he's a bit of a bummer in this story, because he's kind of depressed, because it makes him more an outsider, because unlike other characters, he's never had a birthday, he's never been born. And there's this scene, and it's absolutely gorgeously written scene, where Sarah Jane is talking to Luke, and Luke is kind of just like, this is just another thing that makes me different. And when I started out, I knew that, I don't have a birthday and stuff, though I did have a created, and he makes this joke about creation day, and I liked that little funny moment. And he thought that, it might get easier over time, but it's not. I still see more differences between me and other kids, and Sarah Jane is just like, there's nothing wrong with being different. In fact, being different is the better possibility, but, I understand, you are different to other kids. Beautifully written scene. Probably one of the best scenes of Sarah Jane out there. I will have to say, however, Luke's actor, Tommy Knight, I don't think he pulled it off particularly well here. I mean, Luke has always had this kind of strange speech about him, the way he speaks and the way his dynamic is, almost as if like he is a baby himself, trapped in a 14-year-old body with a brain, with a genius brain, but still he's still learning, he's still in like the early days of his development. But I feel like he could have pushed it a bit further in this role. I mean, I don't blame him for sets, and I've seen him great in other episodes, but in that scene, I feel like he did kind of let the scene down there. Elizabeth Sladen absolutely owns it. Like, Elizabeth Sladen really just gravitates actors towards her, and each character that she interacts with, it feels like there's this massive bond between them. But anyway, Sarah Jane and Ronnie go to investigate Truman, and I love how like Truman is just like, he kind of understands why Sarah Jane's already there, and there's a bit where she's secretly trying to scan for alien technology on her wristwatch, and Truman's just like, go ahead, scan, you're not going to find anything. There's nothing here to scan. I just read the stars and prophesize, and you use science. It's just different sides of the same coin, which kind of scares Sarah Jane to a sense, because, it's reality. And Truman is like, right, I've become more powerful. Look, and he shoots a lightning bolt on Ronnie's coat, which bursts a part of it into flame, and it gets burnt. When they take it to Mr. Smith, he says that it's been burnt, but it's been burnt by nothing. As if the material was just kind of taken out of reality, of sense. Very, very interesting dynamic. Now, Clive has some sort of connection now with Truman after him being touched on the shoulder. And Truman actually tracks Clive down to try and get this, to try and basically stop Sarah Jane from interfering with his plans, as he basically has been organised to appear in this massive supernatural program, and so which will get his message across to the world, because he has some sort of influence on technology which allows him to be on every TV regardless of what channel it's on. I don't even think it turns off when people turn off the plugs. I don't think that was ever actually established in the story. This leads into a really great cliffhanger, which has Truman basically announced to the world that he is going to control everything, everyone, and he takes like one of the star signs, and anyone who's under that star sign, which includes Rani's mother, gets hypnotized by Truman to worship the ancient light, and so they all come hypnotized. They all come towards him. Whilst Clyde, which is now hypnotized by Truman, goes into Sarah Jane's basement and basically creates this storm, which Mr. Smith doesn't actually recognize. He, from his point of view, nothing is happening, and that leads into a cliffhanger, a really great cliffhanger. I was getting a bit worried because when they did Clyde being hypnotized, I was worrying we would get into a scene in which the characters don't know that Luke is being hypnotized, and it will slowly be like a reveal or a twist to the characters, but we know. Though that could be good, I was kind of hoping it wouldn't, and luckily it didn't. As soon as Clyde got into the attic, all the characters realised there's something strange about him. He's talking funny, he's talking odd. And that cliffhanger with Clyde being under control, that kid really knows how to give a good performance there. I think it's easily, as far as I'm concerned, from my point of view, that is his best performance yet. He's much more toned down, his voice is a lot more quiet, and his hand gestures are a bit more mystical in their approach, which really gives this cool feeling about him, those different presents to the Clive that we're usually interpreted. And so that leads into, of course, part two. And what I really like about this story is that usually, you have the 3-act structure. And Act 3 is usually where the big stakes are starting to risen. But here, the stakes start to rise just before part 1, leaving part 2 to feel like a really epic story. I have to keep reminding myself that this isn't a series finale. We have characters being taken from the road and stuff, and basically becoming a massive global threat. Of course, we only really see a very localized version of the threat, but it is obviously implied that this is taken over everywhere as we get like this massive beam coming from the sky as Truman makes this circle around him. He slowly starts to control everyone, which puts the characters on a sort of timer to try and get things done before he takes over the control. And there's a criticism with this story that I've heard where it's kind of clear what's happening from our point of view, but I think A, it does kind of work in the narrative, and B, you do have to remember that it is kind of for kids in a sense. Essentially how they resolute the cliffhanger for part 1, which I like, but it isn't solved straight away. There is a bit of time dedicated to them trying to bring back Clive and stop him from being this hypnotized freak. And I like how we get the scene in which Clive he's basically about to kill Sarah Jane, and Sarah Jane is just like, please, I know you don't want to do it, so I'm just going to let you do it, because I know deep down you're still there and you will not hurt me. And whilst he's about to kill Sarah Jane, Luke touches him on the shoulder and Clive breaks out of it. Now, in the scene, it's made to look like, obviously, it's what actually happened is not what the characters think. What the characters think has happened is that Sarah Jane basically pushed Clive to do something that he wouldn't do originally, and that broke him out of the hypnosis, which is actually a very logical way of thinking about it in terms of the character's point of view, especially how in Christmas Invasion we had a very similar resolution to that, and so there is kind of that, and we get a twist that isn't actually what happens. And a lot of people criticize the story for the fact that we, as a viewing audience, they made it a bit too clear what actually happened in terms of directing, in terms of what has been shot, what has been closed up, what gets a close up, what gets shown. what is actually being revealed to a viewing audience. To us, it seems pretty obvious. But again, A, it's for kids. They might have not picked that up. And it might have been a nice little nod that might have been like, oh yes, I actually realised that. And it was actually smart. There's a nice little plot twist later on in the episode. But also as well, I like how, despite we knowing that, that what actually happened, our characters don't figure it out. And so when they go basically charging in to stop Truman because they think now that they know what is happening, we as a viewing audience actually know what's actually happening and what actually stopped him. And so that does kind of bring this tension. Now, I've got to mention that Truman is played by the magnificent Ross Abbott, who was this entertainer in the 80s and the 90s, and his performance here is just a bun. You can see he's just really enjoying it. It is really cheesy, it is over the top, but you can't help but fall in love with it. It's exactly the same thing I can say about Bradley Walsh's portrayal of Odd Bob in the episode Day of the Clowns, which it's just, the villain's just so over the top, and it's so clearly that the director's like, just have fun. Just have a lot of fun. And it's funny because they're both directed by Michael Cranigan. Now, speaking of Cranigan, you might remember in my Day of the Clowns video, I said I had criticisms of the way he directed it. I'm glad to say that this story doesn't have those criticisms. I think mainly that's because this story, like I said, cuts away from the fat. The story gets really quick into the action. In fact, like I said, the third act seems to start at the end of part one. So part two is really just this massive event feeling storyline. But that does mean that, in terms of a narrative, part two feels kind of weak. It feels like a lot of plot, very little actually going on in terms of character development, which is sad because part one had a lot of great moments, especially with Luke and his realization that he is a lot more different than what he originally thought, and of course we as a viewing audience kind of know that that's going to play a part in this story, and that the scene in which what actually happens is that basically we learn that Luke, because he wasn't born, he was created, he doesn't have a star sign, and so he actually can like cure people of this mind control by touching them. And he actually, when he realizes this, he actually holds the hands of everybody and they get all cured and everybody gets the men's back, with the exception of Truman, who actually wants to be controlled by the ancient light, which is a really cool dynamic. But it does kind of mean that for the majority of part two, it's mainly our characters not realizing stuff that we already know, and so despite there being that, obviously, that great tension there, it doesn't leave much for character, and a lot of nice smaller moments are completely left out in part two. But I will say, however, there are some really great lighting in this story, as the theatre with this purple light could have looked cheesy. It could have looked like a real-time pictures made for DVD video, made for video film. But I feel it's just used just enough. And I especially love in the conclusion of this story when they've defeated, or at least they thought they defeated him, when they hold hands and all the mind control has been taken out and all the lights go down. I love that, the scenery of that way. It's just got this black void for a background, and our characters just really stand out. I love when stories do that on TV. It really lets the actors stand out, and it gives this very surreal feel to the narrative. I feel like some of the outdoor shots feel a bit too whimsical in some shots. But most of the more interior shots are very dynamic with some great camera motion and some great character beats in terms of how the episode is shot. And so the story concludes with Truman basically evaporating as he just won't give up and goes into the stars, and basically they're trying to explain what happens. It does make a question what happens with the Rani's father, because he witnessed the mind control. Also, I just realised 2 stories where there's a public mind control going along back to back, and both directed by Cranigan. I don't know. But the father has witnessed both of these events. So, is this where he slowly starts to pick up that something isn't right? I hope so, because if the next story starts with him basically not realising that something odd is going on, and then stuff odd comes on, it will feel odd and will be a drag on the next story. But there's only time will tell on that. But I did feel that was kind of strange here, how he wasn't like, wait, what about that? Something similar happened like this, like last time with the kids, and now it's like everybody, and now the news says it was a hypnotic suggestion by the public television, but he buys it. The ending seems to imply he does, because they're all just like, he's happy that he's got his wife back, and they have this like nice little family moment. And also the story ends with Luke basically telling Sarah Jane, it's like, me not being born, me being different was a good thing. In fact, it saved the world today. And then he basically is like, could this day be my special day? Essentially his birthday. And Sarah Jane is just like, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. And Luke's just like, can I get presents? Yeah, you can have presents, and you can have parties and everything. And they go off through the door as the credits roll in. So that's Secret of the Stars. Overall, I had a lot of nitpicks, a lot of issues throughout the narrative. But overall, I think this is probably the most fun in the series of Series 2 so far. Especially with the fact that the big epic narrative kicks in right at the end of Part 1, even Part 2, to feel this epic narrative. But I feel it is a bit dry in certain places. The story mainly relies on your interest in star signs, which I'm personally not. So I keeps on forgetting like whose star sign was what, and was waiting. It's like, okay, I'm trying to remember now. Which one's Sarah Jane now? Which one's Rani? Which one is Clive? I'm struggling to keep all of this track in my head. It's all really confusing. There are some really great character beats here, but especially in Part 2, there's not enough there to keep interests going if you're a much more character-focused viewer. But it's a lot of fun. It's great action pieces, great run around. I just wish it could have been a lot better, personally. So anyway, that's Secret of the Stars. So join me next time when I think it's Rani's friend finds something, and Clive reunites with his father. So join me next time for The Mark of the Berserker. And I'll see you next time on the Doctor Who Marathon. Ta-ra.